Let's start then with rhyme in Sylvia Plath's poem, Mad Girl's Love Song. Now this is a poem in which the rhyme and the rhyme scheme is very, very prominent. It's very much in your face, or perhaps better, in your ear. You can't escape it. And indeed, one of its functions then is to help us identify that this poem is a particular kind of poem. It's a villanelle. And as we saw elsewhere, villanelles are very rule-bound forms. They have to contain 19 lines, for example. The first line of the poem and the third line of the poem, moreover, have to reoccur at preordained moments in the poem as well. And what's more, they have to adhere to a strict rhyme scheme of A, B, A in the first 5 stanzas, A, B, A in the final stanza. And I've marked this on the screen in colour. So all the words in blue rhyme, all the words in yellow rhyme. Dead, head, red, or again, sane, name. Now you may have noticed that I skipped a few of the rhymes here because actually not all of the rhymes in this poem are exact, and we'll think in a moment about why this might be. But nonetheless, in keeping with most villanelles, what you then get are 2 sounds, just 2 sounds, repeating at the end of every line again and again and again. And this can be used by villanelle writers in a number of ways. Of course, it emphasises this sense of repetition, and this can be used to convey a sense of insistence, or, and this is what I think is going on in this poem, a sense of the speaker's obsession. She cannot stop thinking about this same thing. She cannot escape, as it were, her own thoughts, her own feelings about this man. And one of the ways in which this obsession is really played out dramatically in this poem is through the constant use of the same sounds, or as we'll see, more or less the same sounds at the end of each line. So we've already seen then a couple of functions that the rhyme scheme is performing in this poem. For one thing, it's identifying for those who know what they're listening to that this is a villanelle. And as with poetry in general, if you know what it is you're listening to, this can bring in you certain expectations which the poem can then play with. Does it actually live up to the kinds of things villanelles are about? Does it actually follow all the rules of the villanelle? And so on and so forth. So rhyme is an important part of establishing this broader framework of expectations that we then experience in the particular form in which it's enacted here. So that's the first thing. The rhyme helps identify this as a villanelle. The second thing is that by being quite repetitive, limited and obsessive, it gives us a stronger sense of the personality who is speaking to us in this poem, for example. So rhyme has a number of general functions here, but do the specific rhymes, the words that actually form the rhymes in this poem, do they have any added meaning from their position as rhyme words, or is their position primarily to support the greater rhyme scheme? This is where we need to be careful, because this tends to be where critics or students overdo their interpretations, trying to find massive significance in everything. And poets generally a bit more careful than that. If every single rhyme word was heavily freighted with meaning, then this could affect the poem as a whole. It could make it too heavy, for example. But let's just look briefly at the B rhymes. I'm just going to stick with the full rhymes, because as you'll notice, again, does not really rhyme or fully rhyme with in or, well, perhaps men, but it's again men, it's not exact. So let's just think about the full rhymes. Again, well, this is a poem of repetition, again and again and again. It's interesting that this is the final B rhyme we get as well. Once again we get the word again, and unlike the A lines, there are no rules that say you have to repeat in the B lines anything that's been said earlier. So this is a specific choice by the poem, and I think this repetition, this echoing of again at the beginning and the end, gives us a sense that this is something that's going around and around and around. What about name? Does this have any significance? Well, perhaps you can find some. For myself, not particularly. I think this is one of those words, of course it's fulfilling the sense of the line that it's in. It's also keeping the rhyme scheme going, but I think the fact it's a rhyme, for me anyway, doesn't contribute much to the poem, which again shows that rhyme can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and it's always connected up with how you interpret the broader poem. Insane, on the other hand, this is clearly a very important word in this poem, because this poem raises the question of, in what sense is the speaker mad? Is she mad with love? Has she been driven mad by love? Or is she mad and the whole thing is just taking place in her head and doesn't have any reality at all? So for me, in contradistinction to, say, name, the rhymes like again, which comes twice, and insane do have an extra weight. But what about these B rhymes that don't quite fit? In and men. Do they have any meaning as words, as rhyme words? Well, I would again say in isolation, it would be hard to make much of either of them. I mean, what does the word in what way does that have any special significance for this poem? You could perhaps say men does if you read this in a very gendered way, but it's not entirely obvious. What I think is interesting about these two lines then is that they show us a different way in which rhyme is playing a function, a variation, if you like, on the basis tune of the rest of the piece. Look at the lines in which they come. And arbitrary blackness gallops in. In itself seems an arbitrary choice. It doesn't really quite fit the rhyme scheme of the villanelle. It suggests that this obsession, it can give a sense of being very, very fixed, but perhaps there is a degree of arbitrariness at work here. So just as there's arbitrariness in the universe she describes, so there is a bit of arbitrariness in the way she expresses herself. You can say something similar, I think, about this full stanza. In fact, I'll come on to the A rhymes in the moment, but they all rhyme: dead, head, red, bed, but not really fade. So here in this stanza we have two lines that ends with sounds that almost rhyme in the way they're supposed to, but don't quite. Well then, what are these lines actually describing? They are describing the universe collapsing. God vanishes, hell disappears, Satan disappears, the whole universe just collapses, potentially, and becomes empty. Well, you could say that with these not quite rhymes at the end, something similar is going on with the villanelle. The universal rules of the villanelle are likewise in danger here of being toppled over. And we may think, actually, as a general thought, what might this mean for the speaker? She's obviously very much trapped in her thoughts and her feelings in this poem. If this were all to just fall apart, would this be a freedom for her? Or would it be a world in which she couldn't survive? So again, here are just three rhyme words that I think do have specific meaning, not in and of themselves. In and men are not significant words in this poem, but what they enact as rhymes or half rhymes or near rhymes does have some kind of meaning. So this brings me on to the A rhymes: dead and head, red, bed, and so on. And of course, dead and head are two words that keep coming back. So do they have particular significance? Now it should be said that one of the ways the villanelle is set up is rather like a dance. They actually supposedly come from country dances. And what you get in a villanelle is a sort of dance between these two repeated lines. So you get dead and head, just one line between them in the opening stanza, then you only get one of them at the end of each stanza, but you still hear the other somehow. They're sort of dancing around each other, orbiting around each other, and then right at the end of the poem, they're brought right next to one another. So at this point, you can feel, you can hear, you can sense their relationship, whether they actually fit together in an interesting way or they're constantly colliding with one another. But is there significance to the words head and dead? Well, I think head is quite easy to justify. This is an obsessive poem that potentially is going on inside her head, and she's trapped inside that. So this gives a sense, I think, this repetition of the word head, 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 makes us wonder about the reality of all of this, but also gives us a sense of someone's head as something that traps us, something we can't quite get outside of or escape. Dead, I think is a bit more difficult. Is her love dead? Has something in her died? Or do we feel that this adds a more morbid sense to the poem more generally, that actually the thought of death is very much in the speaker's mind? That's a tentative suggestion, because I just want to close my discussion of this particular poem by reiterating this point that we always have to interpret the rhyme in relation to what's going on in the rest of the poem. And there will never be an entirely correct answer to either of these things, but we need to come up with interpretations that somehow match what we want to say about individual formal elements in the poem and what we want to say about the poem as a whole.